Hey everyone, Social Solipsist here for another episode of 52 and 52, and this week I'm taking a look at Night in the Woods. Now, this game was very lovingly gifted to me by my friend Spencer, who picked it up pretty soon after its release and praised it very, very highly above many, many things. And said I absolutely needed to play it. So, in the interest of forcing me to play it sooner rather than later, knowing how I operate, he gifted me a copy a while back, and I've just gotten around to playing it because I felt like it was an appropriate time for me to play it. So let's get right into this. This game is wonderful. It's fantastic. It is very definitely high up there in certainly in the games I've played this year, if not all time. It's not without some significant issues though. So let's we'll get into that. On the very very good elements of it. This game hurts my soul to play. It is heavy. It hangs heavy on you when you're playing it, even when it's being funny, even when it's being light, when the characters are just having a good time. Something about it. Whether it's the things that are going on in the background of the game or anything else, the characters are deep and nuanced, and this game just it hurts you to play, little by little. It's throughout its playtime, it is relatable and it is painful, and it addresses a lot of pretty personal topics. But without ever being preachy or judgy or trying to really tell people how to live. I think in a lot of ways, the message that it sort of tries to get across, if anything, is just be better than the person you were yesterday. Just try and be better. So moving right along, it has a really beautiful art and animation style. An amazing amount of work went into this, and outside of things like Cuphead, which obviously has been all over the gaming sphere as of late for the amazing and painstaking work that went into its animation. It's hard to play second fiddle to that, but Night in the Woods definitely falls into the category of not being quite that level of insane, but still just incredibly beautiful, and obviously, a lot of very dedicated hard work was put in to get things just right, to get like the float of the limbs as you jump, and like the way the arms and legs move when you make a sudden turn from one side to the other. Just little things that look amazing. It's not without its issues. Some of the static shots that happen in the interior of some places are a little bit weird, and show a little bit of the issues with some of the animation tricks they used to do that style. Little weird 3D things on this 2D or ostensibly 2D animation style that just look a little bit odd. Likewise, I would say that I've got some notes in here that I'm having to revise on the fly because I took them as I was playing, and things changed a little bit as I went through. I would say that any screenshot in the game is a piece of art. Or that's what I would say for 90% of the game. There are a few areas where either for lack of resources or who knows what else, there are some areas that just feel kind of sparse. that doesn't change the fact that the art style itself does a huge amount to fill the room and make it look great. But you know, you can apply all the color you want, but if some of the elements are missing, then there are a few areas that I think fall a little bit flat. But generally speaking, a good 95% of the scenes you'll see in the game, you can take a screenshot at any point, and it'll be an amazing screenshot. Getting into characterization a little bit, I think all of the characters are pretty interesting. Obviously, there's only so much you can pack into its fairly short runtime. My understanding is that I played for a little under 8 hours. Generally, my understanding is that the runtime for most people is somewhere between 6 and 10. So there's only so much characterization you can put in that amount of time. But I think they do a pretty extraordinary job of, you know, giving you a lot of information about the characters, and not in ways that are, you know, that would typically draw issue for most people. Everything we learn about the main character May and everyone else is very subtly done. There's very little sort of exposition to speak of, or if you know, there are bits of exposition, but it's never, hey, one character is telling the other one a story so that the audience knows, the player knows. When they do that, it's the story's told for a reason. Things are told for a reason. Characters are getting information for very good reasons. And it's not even just the character on screen needs to know information. It's this leads into how these two characters interact and what the history behind XYZ thing was, and it's really excellently done. Likewise, there are a lot of very painfully human moments of being very kind of cringy, but as much as I hate cringy scenes and cringy humor, it's very well subverted by the sort of the feeling of it being so naturally cringy. It's not, hey, this character's weird because we thought it'd be great for them to be weird. It's these feelings of, oh God, I know people who are exactly like this, and having them painted in this particular way with just this little tweak is making me see exactly what those people are like. Or even, you know, the feeling of, oh God, sometimes I am like this, and that like, hurts you, and you realize how the characters are built very well. Their interactions are built very well, and you know, it's never too on the nose or to hit you over the head with it. It's very well done. So getting into some more critical sides of things. The lack of voice acting isn't inherently a problem. As a matter of fact, I'd say that it actually benefits the style of the game by having a more uncluttered. It sort of adds to the uncluttered feeling of the game. The game, in many ways, is very minimalist in its design, in its story, in its exposition, so on and so forth. And I think that having everyone voice acted would actually have been a mistake. But that said, there's literally no differentiation between the, let's just call them like boops of dialogue when characters talk for almost all the scenes, with a few exceptions, which is a little weird. As their text scrolls, you get the little boop noises of the words coming out, that are very common in RPGs and visual novels, and in many ways I would classify this game as a visual novel. But there's no differentiation between the various characters, and that wouldn't be necessarily a problem, except for that sometimes they have scenes where there's no music, and that they go on for a long time, and so you can get a 15-minute scene of just, the single tone boop, over and over and over as characters have a discussion. And I think it could be done very subtly. I don't think you need to have like an extremely different noise for each that is representative of each character's voice. But that's not to say that you couldn't change the tones a little bit to just in a very subtle way differentiate to the player's ear who's speaking, and just it's a subconscious thing, I would say. So that's sort of more nitpicky than anything else. On the whole, the sound design is pretty amazing. And I would actually, I found out as the credits were rolling that the sound design was done by an artist that I've used their music on the channel before. A Shell in the Pit apparently did a major part of the sound design in this game. So I'm totally going to take credit for making them famous by requesting to use their music on my channel and speaking with them before. So yeah, totally going to take credit for that one. But I digress. Anyway, in terms of the actual navigation of the game, and don't worry, I should have said it at the beginning, but I'm definitely not going to get into what I would qualify as spoiler territory here. I would have liked some sort of quick travel option. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy, going through the town every day. It definitely deserves the walkthrough, and if you're just zipping from one place to another, you're going to miss a lot of the smaller things that you're allowed but not required to interact in. But occasionally, I had to go one place, and I knew that the only thing I had left to do was go talk to a character, and I had no way to do that except for to spend, several minutes just walking across from one side of town to another, when I just wish I could have had, a quick little, hey, go here button. But again, a little bit nitpicky. So to get into a little more depth, I would have preferred, and actually I strictly speaking expected, a more pure kind of character study. The first act of the game, again, not spoiler territory, I don't think, but feel free to correct me and call me an asshole, is very much a character study, which is already a rarity in film. Character studies are a rarity. Things claim to be character studies, but really aren't. It's already a rarity in film, but I love when a good character study is made, and it's almost unheard of in games. I can certainly think of a few that sort of lean into that a little bit, but don't qualify. But I was really expecting this to be a character study of May and the various friends and folks that she interacts with. In many ways, it is. It still is. But there's an issue with the differentiation between... there's 4 chapters, but I'm going to call it the typical 3-act structure, where there's... the first act is very much about character. The second act is getting more into what would probably qualify as the air quotes plot, the meat of the thing, and the third act being the closing actions. And there are really kind of 2 games here. And I don't really know. I played through it all today. I finished it an hour ago, and I haven't fully had time to absorb everything. And I almost wish I had time to wait a little longer to make this video, but I want to get it out. There are kind of 2 games here, and I'm not sure whether it was intentional or how much of it was felt to be a necessity. And the question, I think, really is whether the first act drives the third or the third act drives the first. Because if the first act drives the third, then it does the third a disservice. Not that it isn't a very good lead in to the second and then obviously to the third, but that it misrepresents the intent of the game, the path that it intends to take. And that is not to say that there are not hints of the path that it will take, but they are subtle, and could be interpreted differently. I suppose. I did not think they, personally, from my perspective, I don't think they did a great job of saying this is the route that this game will go. When I hit a significant portion of the way through the second act, I was kind of curious where they were going with this. What was the key plot? What is the intent of the key plot? Is it to tell the story of the plot? Is the whole plot a tool to drive more of the character development and things like that are obviously very key in a character study? And I couldn't really figure that out. And that sort of leads into, is it the other way around? Does the arc of the story rather drive the first act character study? And it obviously doesn't have to firmly be in one camp or another. But I don't know. There's something that's not quite right about it. I was experiencing the third act with, at times, a bit of an incredulous look on my face, trying to figure out how this tied back into the first act and to the characters that I was so enjoying. And again, that's not to say that any of this is inherently bad. The moment to moment, the individual scenes, I think, are all very well concocted on their own. But whether they play well together, whether they, build to that harmonic, that's a little more up in the air for me. Generally speaking, in the same kind of vein, I think that the game meanders a little more than I would prefer. And this was a thought that I was having more in the first act than in the second and third, because obviously with the second and third being more story driven, and the game being what it is, those second and third acts are quite a bit more linear. But I guess even in the first act, I was having some concerns, still under the assumption that this was a character study, that there was plenty of good content that didn't pertain to the main story, but still contributed significantly to characterization, and generally the building of the characters in the game. But there were others, I would say 20% of scenes, where I felt it was a bit more of flat banter, I would say. It felt a little bit unfocused. A few of those would end up coming up later, and be played against in the second and third acts, and credit for setting things up where appropriate. But because I was in some ways blindsided by the tonal shift in the second and third act, um, some of those setup scenes were fairly meaningless, and that should never. When you're directing something, you never want to do the setup without context. There always needs to be a reason to set up something that will be paid off later in the present. You can't, you know, you it's the same as dressing a stage or something like that, and ties into things like Chekhov's gun. The secondary portion of Chekhov's gun is you also don't put the gun on the mantle if there's literally no reason for it to be there aside from the third act payoff. So yeah, there are some writing foibles in there as well. Likewise, on that same sort of thing, I think it has all of the parts of a really extraordinary game, and that's not to say that even any of them are misused, but they could be used just that bit better. This game has been lauded for replayability as well, and there are definitely choices and things, and you make choices to have certain interactions with certain people and not with others, or those sorts of things. And I'm always a bit of two minds with replayability and choice in games. While I like them in theory, I think they're often poorly executed. And even when they're not poorly executed, and they're not poorly executed here, they're very well executed. I think it actually potentially does a disservice to the larger game to have some of the choices be one way or another when they could be both. And again, I'm talking in sort of nebulous terms in the interest, again, of not spoiling anything for anyone. But often I was thinking, why not both? Why am I not taking both sides? Why am I not interacting with multiple people? And often the only answer I could come up with was, this is how the game was built. It was built to have replayability because in some way, maybe it's my cynical brain, but my thought was, well, they're extending it artificially a little bit as a perceived value add to validate the price of the game. And that's not to say this game is expensive. I believe at its initial release it was only $30, if even that. So maybe I'm being cynical there, but for ignoring the my cynical side, I still think that there are a number of things where they could have tied things in better and made an even tighter story by allowing you to experience more of it in your first and potentially only playthrough. And I do think this may be my only playthrough, out of respect, really, for the content therein. Again, to get back to being a little bit nitpicky, there are some later scenes, particularly in the third act, where what I would describe as the cinematography really falls apart. The rest of the game, the first and second acts, are so exemplary in this, so beautifully framed, and the art is so beautiful, that some of the interior scenes, like I had mentioned before, and some of the story pacing that happens in the third act really chops things up. And again, I don't know how much of that was calculated from the start, or whether they intended to build, a character study from the beginning and then realized that, or were told that that was not fully marketable and that they needed to add more story. But in any case, the third act, the short third act, feels choppy in many ways, not only in cinematography, but also in its in the extent of its content and the extent of its payoff. And that rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. Not enough to put me off the game or to make me say anything extraordinarily bad about it, but it just didn't feel quite right. It didn't feel quite like the ending they were expecting. And this doesn't even strike me as particularly unusual in game development for this to happen. It's incredibly common even. I've talked about it multiple times, but not extensively on this channel before, about games that suffer from third act rewrites or other circumstances where the last 20% or 30% of a game can feel very different from the rest of it, either because potentially the writers did not, or wrote something they loved and then were told that it was not marketable or not not viable as for sale. There's all kinds of other things that I can't speak to without being a fly on the wall, but for anyone who plays a lot of video games in a variety of genres, I think this is not unfamiliar territory to have a third act, an ending that feels a little different from the rest and maybe to the game's detriment. So yeah, obviously I've been critical in this review, as I always am, but really at the end of the day, it's out of a great appreciation for what this game is and was, and I absolutely recommend it to anyone who can put up with the style at all. If you can put up with a dialogue heavy game, if you can put up with a platformer at the bare minimum, if you can do those two things, I think you owe it to yourself to play this game. And I can certainly imagine some individuals who aren't thrilled with the lack of gaminess in this game, but I think there's still enough in there to appeal to some of those people as well. Yeah. So I guess in my full conclusion, I just wish that it had a hair more focus. And I can speculate all day about what was and wasn't done from the original script, the original drafts, the writer's vision to the end. And it was a very small team, and I think there was a lot of internal control and very little external control. So I don't think that that's an out. But yeah, just little bits here and there where I think the focus could have been improved, but I can't speak to authorial intent. In any case, thank you guys all for watching yet another episode of 52 and 52, a particularly long one this week, but I think absolutely warranted. And I will see you guys next time.